Christmas in Texas is supposed to be a time of warmth, joy, and family, but for me it was mostly a test of patience and endurance that was a great reminder that family isn't always easy. It was a warm day by holiday standards, sunny, but the cold between me and my stepson Zach could have churned ice all over the neighborhood. I've been married to his father, Roger, for about 5 years now, but I still couldn't get along with Zach. He was stubborn, difficult, and constantly reminded me of everything that wasn't quite right. I hated to say it, but our dynamic was toxic. When Christmas came around, I wished Zach would go to his friends like he usually did because peace was what I really needed. In the early years, I tried to bond with him, to be a friend and not a replacement for his mother. But every attempt was met with resistance, a wall that grew higher and thicker each year. He snapped at me over nothing, rolled his eyes when I spoke, and his contempt was palpable. It wore me down bit by bit until I didn't have the energy left to keep trying. "Why don't you go to your friend Matt's house for Christmas this year? They always have a big family holiday party, right?" I said, only half trying to hide my annoyance as we decorated the tree. Roger had left on one last errand, and it was just Zach and I in the house. I wanted to make it as tolerable as possible, but Zach's constant unwillingness to help was getting on my nerves. He treated every piece of jewelry with such indifference that it was clear he wasn't interested in sharing this moment. Every sigh, every shrug felt like a personal insult, and I could feel my irritation building. He paused, his blue eyes narrowing as he looked at me. He seemed to read my mind and knew exactly what I wanted, to distance myself from him. He didn't say anything, but his silence made me uncomfortable. There was a tension in him that I couldn't quite grasp, something that made the little hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was strange, almost unsettling. I wanted to get rid of the feeling, but it remained like a shadow, even as we continued to decorate the house in silence. Later in the afternoon, when Roger still wasn't home, Zach asked me to help him get some boxes down into the basement. It was an odd request. We weren't going to use anything from there, but I figured that maybe his dad had asked him to do it. I hesitated at first, not knowing if I wanted to be alone with him again, but I didn't want to add to the tension by refusing. I followed him to the door to the basement, and the creaky steps groaned under our weight as we descended into the dimly lit room. The basement was dimly lit and smelled of dust and mustiness that is always present in old basements. As I reached the bottom step, I suddenly felt Zach's hand grab my arm. I turned around, and before I even realized what was happening, he pulled me to him, so close that I could feel his breath. His other hand rested on my waist, and there was hunger in his eyes, a hunger that left me terrified. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking with the panic that gripped me. His face was so close, and the realization of what he was up to struck me like lightning. My heart raced in my chest, adrenaline rushed through me, and fear and disbelief blended into a nauseating mixture. "I just want you to be kinder," he whispered, his voice low and pleading. There was a vulnerability in his voice that I hadn't expected. It confused me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the inappropriate pressure of his grip. His fingers dug into my side, and I saw a mixture of emotions in his eyes: desperation, confusion, something akin to hope. It was twisted, wrong, and I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. My heart pounded frantically. I tried to pull away, but he held me tightly. "We haven't had anything since Daddy," he started, but his words were cut off halfway through, sounding almost desperate. It took all my strength to push him away, my hands shaking as I did so. I pushed as hard as I could, and he stumbled back, his eyes widening with shock. "You can't do that," I snarled, my voice sharper than I'd ever heard it before. I could see the shock in his eyes, like he hadn't expected me to push him away. The air between us became thick, filled with something that had no place in our house, especially during the holidays. You have to leave." Now, my voice shook, but I stayed my ground, looking at him with all the anger and fear I felt. For a long time he just stood still, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he turned and, without saying a word, walked up the stairs. I followed him, trying to keep some distance between us. I felt a mixture of emotions I couldn't even untangle: danger, disgust, confusion, and maybe even a twisted form of pity for the loneliness that had driven him to such an act. I knew that Zach had always had a hard time with his father's absence, Roger's long hours, and the fact that everything else took priority over his son. But this was something I never imagined. When Roger came home that night, I didn't say anything. How could I? I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. The atmosphere was still tense. The decorations seemed to mock the holiday spirit. Zach stayed in his room for the rest of the evening, and I made no effort to call him over for dinner. I cooked the food, set the table, and tried to pretend everything was okay, but my hands were shaking, and that moment in the basement kept popping up in my head. I felt a heaviness come over me, a sense of dread I couldn't shake off. This was not the Christmas everyone should have. There was no happy gift exchange, no laughter, no warmth, just silence, an uncomfortable, unresolved silence that loomed over our supposedly festive home like a shadow. Roger, oblivious to the tension, tried to make small talk, but my responses were empty, forced. I glanced toward the hallway every now and then, half expecting Zach to show up, half hoping he wouldn't. And as I lay in bed that night, with Roger snoring softly beside me, I realized that some bridges just can't be built. Some chasms are too big, and sometimes the only thing left to do is defend yourself against people who are supposed to be family. The next morning I woke up with a sense of determination. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I couldn't ignore what had happened, couldn't let it smolder in the shadows of our lives. I waited for Roger to leave again, another errand, another excuse to leave me alone with Zach. I knocked on Zach's door, my heart pounding as I waited for him to answer. When he finally opened, he looked at me warily, wary. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm despite the fear bubbling up inside me. He hesitated, then stepped aside, letting me into his room. It was a mess, clothes strewn across the floor, an open laptop lying on the bed. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "What you did yesterday was wrong," I began, my voice soft but firm. "I don't know what you're going through, and I don't know why you think it's okay, but it's not. We can't go on like this." He didn't say anything, just stared at the floor, his shoulders tense. I could see the conflict he was going through, the way his jaw tensed, the way he clenched his hands into fists. For a moment I thought he might lash out at me, that the conversation would escalate into something even worse. But then he nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the ground. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely audible. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to erase what had happened. But it was something. A small step, a tiny crack in the wall between us. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I think you should stay with Matt for a while," I said, and my voice shook. "Until things settle down. We all need some space." He looked at me, his eyes widening, and for a moment I saw something akin to fear in them. But he didn't argue. He just nodded, and I turned and left the room before the held-back tears could spill over. As I closed the door behind me, I felt relieved, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't a solution to the problem, but it was a start, and maybe it was the first step toward finding some semblance of peace in this fractured family.